In March 1941, England lay under a shroud of fog, with streaks of white-grey clouds curling around the Dover coastline like thin smoke clinging to war. From the ground, the sound of a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine rose steadily, then suddenly went silent, leaving only the wind slicing through the propeller. High above, an RAF pilot dove in pursuit. Just 1.5 seconds later, the engine cut out. In that brief silence, he saw the enemy recede, then abruptly close in 300 yards, the distance of death. He pulled the stick in vain. Fuel flooded the float chamber, the fire went out, and the German Bf 109 spiraled in, firing rounds into the body of the British aircraft. That scene repeated weekly over the skies of the Channel front. According to RAF Fighter Command reports, during 1 week in early March, the Luftwaffe deployed 43 Bf 109 seconds. The AF engaged in 27 dogfights, resulting in 23 British planes shot down 14 Hurricanes, 9 Spitfires. The statistic was recorded in the operations logbook. Engine failures reported in 38% of negative. G dives. That cold number was a death sentence for dozens of pilots. A technical flaw not due to bullets, not due to human error, but the pure mechanical reaction of fuel when pulled backward under negative acceleration. According to the 1941 Merlin engine maintenance documents, the British Skinner's Union-type carburetor operated based on gravity pressure. When the aircraft inverted, fuel surged upward, the float chamber flooded, fuel spilled through the jet orifice, and the engine choked. In 1.5 seconds, all power vanished. That was enough time for a German pilot to shoot through the left wing and the still-dead engine of a Spitfire. That 1.5 seconds felt like eternity. Pilot John Davies wrote in his personal diary, just days before he was shot down over Calais. At bases like Biggin Hill and Tangmere, footsteps echoed across the runway, mingling with the heavy scent of gasoline. Young pilots in their 20s prepared for takeoff, fully aware something was betraying them, not weapons, but design. One RAF engineer later recalled, "We were losing men not to bullets, but to physics. It was a moment suspended between two worlds. Engineering hadn't caught up, and war didn't wait." According to the Air Ministry statistical summary, the average British pilot survived 57 hours of combat flight before being wounded, missing, or killed. When the cause wasn't enemy fire but engine failure, fear wasn't directed at the enemy, it lay within their own aircraft. Every time they dove, they knew that a 38% chance could be theirs. A deviation in fuel flow lasting a few thousandths of a second could decide a life. From the cockpit, the world narrowed to two colours, the blue of the sea and the silver of metal. The alarm blared, sweat rolled down the cheeks, and just before firing, the Merlin died again. It wasn't a battle anymore, it was a gamble, another pilot recounted in a post-war interview at Farnborough in 1947. In a Royal Aeronautics Commission recording, his voice could still be heard, slowly. "When the engine stopped, even the wind seemed to hold its breath." The maintenance logs of that month were filled with handwritten notes, sometimes just 3 words. Negative G failure. In the engine rooms, mechanics dismantled float chambers, wiped fuel, checked pressure valves, and then reassembled everything the same. No one found a solution. In the skies, pilots learned to fake maneuvers. Instead of diving head-on, they banked slightly before descending, creating a sense of positive G to keep the engine running. But by doing so, they lost their speed advantage. The Bf 109, powered by a Daimler-Benz DB 601 with direct fuel injection, had no such limitation. According to Luftwaffe after-action reports, German pilots exploited that weakness, luring British aircraft into nose-over dives, then circling back to fire once the opponent's power cut out. From July 1940 to early 1941, 19 RAF pilots died due to engine failure in combat. All investigation reports cited the same cause: fuel flooding in a float-type carburetor. No one said it aloud, but every pilot carried the same quiet thought. The system they trusted could kill them before the enemy had a chance. In the Memorial Hall at Duxford, rows of wooden chairs draped in black fabric sat beneath yellow light, shining down on a brass plaque engraved with the names of the missing. An old pilot stood in the hall in 1952, voice raspy. Back then, 5 seconds was the longest silence in the world. The hall fell quiet. Outside the glass doors, the old Spitfire still sat on display, a metal patch on its belly marking where it once took fire. According to the March 1941 tactical summary from Fighter Command HQ, 11 group squadrons were ordered to limit dive angle under 40 degrees when attacking head-on, a temporary measure to avoid engine cutouts. But that meant giving up the ability to chase at over 400 miles per hour, Spitfire's only edge. The survivors called it a silent defeat, a loss that required no gunfire. When the Merlin fell silent mid-air, the entire crew felt something strange. The wind seemed to disappear, and the cockpit felt hollow. A few men said in that moment they could hear their heartbeat louder than the gunfire. Then the engine came back, or didn't. And if it didn't, another plume of smoke fell into the sea above England. In that context, war was no longer just a clash of nations, but a race between engineering thought and physical limits. On one side were the pilots gambling their lives on 1.5 seconds of silence. On the other were the researchers wrestling with equations in the Farnborough lab. When casualty reports reached the Air Ministry, the final line was always the same. Investigation continues. And somewhere else, an engineer named Beatrice Schilling was preparing to turn that line into history. Because before a single bullet was fired, Britain's real battle had already begun in the engine room, among numbers, measurements, and lives. And in that silence, the Luftwaffe began to lose. As the skies over Britain were shrouded in smoke and the salty wind from the Channel, another front line was quietly taking shape. It had no gunfire, no contrails, but its outcome decided every life or death sortie. This war unfolded in the Farnborough laboratories, in the Rolls-Royce factories in Derby, and in the oil-smudged blueprints of hundreds of engineers. There, discussions were not about tactics, but about the principles of fuel flow. According to Daimler-Benz's 1938 technical report, Germany had perfected the direct fuel injection system for the DB601 engine, fitted to the Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter. This principle allowed fuel to be pumped directly into the cylinders under pressure, completely eliminating the float chamber, enabling German aircraft to invert, dive, and roll while maintaining stable power output. Luftwaffe pilots could plunge headfirst into attack maneuvers, surpassing all limits while the engine rhythm held steady. According to the document Luftwaffe Operational Summary 1940, the DB601 maintained 98% efficiency at negative pitch angles, a figure that stunned British engineers. Meanwhile, Britain chose a different path. The Rolls-Royce Merlin, the heart of the Spitfire and Hurricane, was designed under the philosophy of simple, robust, and fast to produce. The Skinner's Union float-type carburetor operated reliably under normal conditions, was easy to manufacture, simple to maintain, and most importantly, suitable for mass production. When war broke out, Britain prioritized quantity over perfection. According to the 1940 production report, factories could complete one Merlin engine every 28 hours, whereas the German direct injection engines required 3 times that duration. The problem was that this efficiency came at a cost in the sky. The divergence in engineering philosophies stemmed from national mindsets. Germany pursued a complete the design before entering battle approach. Every improvement underwent rigorous testing, with all specifications fine-tuned to laboratory-level precision. Britain, amid crisis, believed in firefighting during the war. This pragmatic thinking made them more adaptable, but also placed their pilots in life-threatening trials. One side built its systems on absolute precision, the other relied on the belief that what was good enough could still save tomorrow. According to a Rolls-Royce internal memo from September 1940, the design team had launched a project for a pressure carburetor, eliminating the float chamber and controlling fuel flow through pressure, simulating the principle of direct injection. The project was codenamed RR divided by 43 amperes, and was expected to be completed by 1943 or 1944. But Britain didn't have 2 years. Spitfires still needed to take off every morning, while the engine stall rate during dives remained at 38%. "We were losing our best men to a valve and a float," wrote Chief Engineer Stanley Hooker in a report to the Air Ministry at the end of that year. Time became the second enemy. According to the 1941 Royal Aircraft Establishment Report, the Luftwaffe launched over 1,000 bombing sorties each month, and the RAF had to scramble almost as many to respond. Every hour meant another pilot might die not because of the enemy, but because the fuel wouldn't flow in the right direction. In the test chambers, Merlin engines roared on steel stands day and night, dials twitching, black smoke coating the ceiling. Young engineers took shifts monitoring pressure, testing each angle of tilt, every simulated negative G-force. They knew they were not racing German engineering, but racing against the smoke rising from the channel. Across the border, Daimler-Benz engineers read British intelligence bulletins and scoffed. They believed that the advantage of fuel injection would secure the Luftwaffe's dominance in Europe's skies. A German pilot later said after the war, "We never feared the Spitfire's guns, only its engine when it worked." Cruel words, but true. During that phase, the confrontation between pilots was no longer balanced. Germans could invert and return for a counterattack, while the British had to circle slowly just to keep their engines running. Meanwhile, the Rolls-Royce factories in Derby ran 24 hours a day. According to an internal report from February 1941, over 12,000 workers rotated across 3 shifts, producing more than 500 Merlin engines per week. Yet none of them knew that the product they were building contained a fatal flaw that had yet to be resolved. Post-combat engine checks repeatedly noted the same phrase: fuel surge during negative G. Engine stalled for 1.5 seconds. Every report ended with the same conclusion: requires further study. In the evenings, when air raid sirens rang out from Dover, the lights in the RAE test lab stayed on. Engineers continued taking notes, adjusting fuel pressure, and redrawing flow diagrams. One of them, Beatrice Schilling, sat at the end of the table, quietly flipping through charts. In the handwritten notes that remain, she wrote, "If we can't stop the flow, then we limit it." That idea was simple, but held the seed of a solution that would change the outcome. War was pushing every limit. When the sirens wailed, factories went dark to avoid bombing, then lit up again as German planes moved on. Every design had to be squeezed into hours, every drawing pushed for time. The Germans controlled time with planning, the British controlled it with effort. The difference wasn't in mechanics, it was in national psychology. One side trusted formulas, the other trusted its ability to fix mistakes. According to Sir Stanley Hooker, head of the Rolls-Royce Supercharger Division, Britain didn't win by being perfect. We won by refusing to wait. From that mindset, a series of small innovations emerged under pressure. And each morning, though the engines might fail at any moment, Spitfires still took to the skies. Every pilot took a gamble when flying. Every engineer on the ground was a timekeeper. Together, they were part of a war without bullets, where the sound of hammers, engine tests, and blueprints fluttering under fans became the music of survival. In his 1941 battlefield journal, General Hugh Dowding, commander of Fighter Command, wrote a brief line: "Our war is fought both in the sky and in the drawings." He understood that to win, Britain needed more than courage, they needed the right equation at the right time. As spring arrived, rain still fell on the southern bases. Among rows of aircraft parked in the mist, one could hear the test rigs in the distance, like the heartbeat of a nation struggling to survive. And somewhere, in a blueprint about to be sent to the Air Ministry, the seed of a technical revolution was being laid down by a woman's pen. Because war doesn't wait for perfection. Britain didn't need the perfect solution, they needed one in time. And in that urgency, the next chapter of survival began. In the history of Britain's wartime industry, some names are engraved on brass plaques, and others are lost among the numbers. Beatrice Schilling belonged to the latter group. In the winter of 1939, While London was still shrouded in fog and the fear of bombs, she walked into the Royal Aircraft Establishment, RAE, at Farnborough, carrying a thin folder and a mechanical engineering degree. She was 32 years old, recently departed from the Ministry of Industry, and the only woman in the engine testing division. Her colleagues looked at her more with curiosity than with respect. They knew she had raced motorcycles, broken the 106 miles per hour's record at Brooklands, and had been awarded the Gold Star by the British Motorcycle Racing Club, a distinction previously achieved by only 2 other women. But this was war, and it was a war fought by men. In those early days, Schilling spoke little. She quietly observed, took notes, and listened as her colleagues debated designs for the Rolls-Royce Merlin. The engineers were struggling with fuel flooding when the aircraft flipped over, and all proposed solutions pointed to redesigning the entire system. "It's the carburetor itself," one team leader said. "We need a new one." In the lab, float chamber models were assembled and disassembled repeatedly, and fuel lines were swapped out for different sizes. The result? Failure. The engine still stalled under -G. Schilling disagreed. In handwritten notes stored in the RAE file from December 1940, she wrote, "The failure is not in the design, but in the flow." While others tried to fix the structure, she focused on something simpler: the nature of the flow. Fuel in the float chamber spilled when the aircraft inverted because there was no limit. "It's not a design flaw, it's an excess," she explained later in a 1964 interview. The difference lay in perspective. Instead of building a new engine, she wanted to teach the old one to function in new conditions. Her test lab was then located on the lowest floor of the engine research wing, a place always filled with the smell of gasoline and metal paint. On her workbench were thin brass sheets, an old lathe, and drawings crowded with pencil marks. Every night after the others had gone home, she stayed behind, assembling miniature models of the fuel path. She didn't speak much, but she was always measuring, recalled former colleague David Hancock in a 1985 BBC radio programme. The only sound left in the room was the lathe cutting into metal, steady, dry and patient. According to the 1941 RAE technical log, Schilling tested 17 different sizes of fuel restrictors before finding the optimal ratio. The result was a brass disc 0.125 inches in diameter, drilled with a central hole of 0.04 inches, just wide enough to restrict fuel flow while maintaining engine pressure. The structure was so simple that almost no one believed it could work. In the internal report, the test supervisor noted, "The device is too simple to be trusted," but in flow simulations, it performed more reliably than any new design. The production cost for each disc was 50 cents, including materials and machining. She machined the first 6 units herself in the workshop, polishing the edges to avoid scratching the fuel lines. She temporarily named it the restrictor. According to her personal notebook, she calculated that during a 400 miles per hour's aerobatic flight, negative pressure would still not cause fuel to surge excessively if this limiter were in place. All data aligned, but the issue was procedural. No unauthorized modifications were allowed to be tested on combat aircraft. In meetings at Farnborough, Schilling faced opposition. A senior engineer said, "It's a patch, not a solution." She replied, "A patch that keeps them alive is still a solution." Her voice was quiet, but firm. According to notes by Stanley Hooker, head of Rolls-Royce Supercharging, it was that very sentence that convinced him to support her unapproved trial. Hooker recalled, "She didn't ask for permission, she asked for a chance. As the war entered early 1941, the RAF lost another 19 pilots to engine failures during dogfights. Reports from Fighter Command were sent to Farnborough, marked urgent. Schilling read each line and paused at one. Engine failure during negative, G-dive, pilot killed. She closed the file and looked out the window, where smoke from Rolls-Royce factories blanketed the sky. A thought formed within her. If approval couldn't come in time, she would act on her own. That night, she went home and pulled out the 500cc Norton motorcycle, the same machine that had helped her set a speed record in 1934. The engine roared, echoing through the empty yard. She told her husband, aerospace engineer George Naylor, "I'm going to Kenley tomorrow." Naylor knew Kenley was the base of 11 Group, where RAF pilots fought day and night. He said nothing. They both understood this was no longer a lab experiment. The next morning, Schilling packed 6 restrictors into a leather pouch and fastened the clasp carefully. On the road to Farnborough, thick fog settled in, and yellow headlights lit the damp path. Raindrops clung to her coat, reflecting the metallic gleam of morning. Every passing second brought her closer to violating military protocol, but she didn't stop. According to 1,941 Air Ministry correspondence, Schilling had no permit for off-site testing beyond RAE. Her actions were recorded as unofficial and unsanctioned. Nevertheless, post-war documents universally recognized this as the turning point in the Merlin crisis. One aviation historian wrote, "She moved faster than the bureaucracy could think." Those who met her remembered the faint smile and a voice barely above a whisper. One technician said, "She would look at the carburetor as if it were alive, not a machine." That was what made her different. She didn't see engineering as something cold, but as a system that could feel. And it was this empathy that allowed her to see what the entire British scientific apparatus had missed. The Merlin's problem wasn't in theory, but in the unbounded nature of reality. Beatrice Schilling wrote no manifesto and argued no further. She believed in results. A 50-cent piece of brass would soon be installed in a real aircraft, and the survival of thousands of pilots would hinge on a tiny 4-inch circle, a weapon that made no sound, yet could change the outcome of the skies. As night fell, she stopped the bike in front of the RAE gate, headlights shining on the sign, "Farnborough, Engine Test Division." The wind rustling through the sheet metal roof sounded like a propeller far away. She gripped the handlebars, smiled faintly, and said to herself, "If they won't let me fix it here, I'll fix it out there." The next day, British history changed course. On the morning of the 14th of March 1941, thick fog blanketed the runway of RAF Kenley, one of the key bases of 11 Group. Against the silvery grey sky, the roar of Merlin engines from the Hurricanes thundered like the heartbeat of Britain in crisis. Beatrice Schilling stopped her Norton motorcycle at the base gate, removed her gloves, and adjusted the leather pouch on her hip. Inside were 6 brass restrictors, each weighing less than 15 grams, hand-machined by her at Farnborough. Today, they would be tested on real combat aircraft. According to Ray Memorandum No. 217/41, Schilling had no authorization for off-site testing. Her bringing the device into Kenley was a violation of regulations, but she understood that if she waited for approval, dozens more pilots might die. Waiting at the technical bay was Sergeant William Cooper, a Merlin engine mechanic with 3 years of experience, who had witnessed 19 pilot fatalities due to carburetor failures. Cooper didn't ask for explanations, didn't sign any forms. He simply asked, "Which aircraft?" Schilling replied, "Squadron Leader Davies." Davies, 24 years old, had flown 41 combat missions, been hit by enemy fire 3 times, and had twice survived engine failure during pursuit dives. Today, he was assigned a routine patrol. He didn't know that his Hurricane Mark IIB would carry a component never approved by the Air Ministry. Outside the hangar, the wind howled through idle propeller blades. Schilling and Cooper crouched by the aircraft's fuselage, disconnecting the fuel line between the pump and the carburetor. In Cooper's hand, the restrictor no larger than a coin, with a 0.04-inch bore was placed into the junction. Using a small soldering iron, he sealed the joint, taking exactly 60 seconds. When finished, Schilling inspected it carefully, her fingertip brushing the bright silver weld. Everything was ready. "Let's hope it breathes right," Cooper murmured. She nodded. No one signed off on a permit. No one took notes. If anything went wrong, there would be no record that they had ever been there. Davies climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, and checked the pressure gauges. The propeller turned, the engine fired up, the Merlin's growl filled the air. According to the Kenley flight log, 14 divided by 3 divided by 41 at 7:42, The Hurricane took off, heading south, flying with 2 other aircraft in a patrol formation of 3. Schilling stood by the runway, binoculars in hand. Every time the engine roared, she held her breath. About 15 minutes later, the flight reached 15,000 feet near the Dungeness area. On the ground, the radio remained silent. Schilling checked her watch. 20 minutes, then 30 minutes, with no word. According to post-war records from the Air Historical Branch, during these first trials, no one at the base knew what the outcome would be. A tiny mistake could cause fuel starvation, an explosion, or complete engine failure. Over the southern sector, Davies spotted 2 Bf-109 seconds moving toward the sea. He signaled his squad mates to hold altitude and dove. His speed surged past 400 miles per hour, negative G-forces strapping him tightly into the harness. Everything happened within 1.5 seconds, a span of time that had previously decided the lives of dozens of pilots. But this time, the Merlin did not stall. The pressure gauge held steady, the roar unbroken. He closed in within 200 yards, pulled the trigger. Bullets ripped through the left wing of the Messerschmitt. The German pilot veered off sharply, trailing black smoke. When Davies pulled up, the Merlin still roared strongly. For the first time in 11 months, he completed a full-power dive without any loss of engine performance. In his post-mission report, Davies wrote a single line: "Engine perfect. Best the Merlin's ever run." At approximately 9:37, all 3 Hurricanes returned to base. When the propellers stopped, Davies stepped down, removed his flight helmet. His face was streaked with oil, but his eyes were unusually bright. Schilling and Cooper approached. Cooper asked, "Any trouble, sir?" Davies looked at them for a moment, then smiled. None, not even a hiccup. He had no idea that in his fuel system, a tiny brass ring no larger than half a coin was doing what hundreds of engineers had not yet achieved. According to RAF maintenance notes, that afternoon Cooper installed 4 more restrictors on the aircraft from the same squadron. A total of 5 Hurricanes flew trials over 3 days, performing 12 dives. The result: 0 technical failures, 0 engine stalls. The data were penciled into Schilling's notebook, her handwriting slightly slanted. All 5 successful. Modification holds. Word spread quickly around the base. Pilots heard about the new device and asked each other, "Is that Miss Schilling's fix?" They gave it all sorts of nicknames: the Washer, the Lifesaver, and eventually, Miss Schilling's Orifice. The name was humorous yet affectionate, reflecting how soldiers turned fear into laughter. The next day, Davies reported to command. In his memo, he wrote, "Request installation of restrictor for entire squadron. Immediate action preferred." When the technical officer objected due to a lack of formal approval, Davies replied curtly, "They can court-martial me after the war." That statement was recorded in the minutes of the Kenley command meeting, 16 divided by 3 divided by 41. By the end of the week, the Air Ministry took notice. A technical officer from 11 Group was dispatched to investigate. When he asked, "Who authorized this modification?" Schilling replied bluntly, "No one. It just works." Silence fell over the room. They looked at each other, then at the results. 12 successful dives. Not a single Merlin stalled. Finally, the officer said, "Then keep doing it." That afternoon, in the squadron canteen, Davies sat with Cooper and Schilling. On the table were cups of tea and the open report. He raised his cup, voice hoarse. "To the woman who fixed our engines." A mechanic behind them muttered, "And saved our skins." They laughed. Amidst the smoke and hoarse chuckles of those who had just survived, the war paused for a few seconds. According to the Air Ministry statistical brief, April 1941, following the successful Kenley trial, the request for full implementation was approved across all units of 11 Group within 4 days. Rolls-Royce was ordered to produce 500 units per week, with Schilling appointed to oversee technical supervision. But it all began that morning, in the heavy fog, when one woman brought 6 brass rings to a combat base. The Kenley story later became legend among engineers. In the RAE Museum, The small plaque beneath the displayed restrictor reads, "Installed without authorization, tested under fire, saved 2,000 lives." That day, Schilling didn't sign any forms, didn't pose for photographs. She simply stood on the runway, watched the hurricane land safely, and whispered to Cooper, "We've done it." And in that moment, the silence of 1.5 seconds ended forever. 4 days after the Kenley test, the Air Ministry issued official approval. Rolls-Royce received orders to produce 500 restrictor units per week, later increased to 1,000. Schilling personally supervised the rollout, moving between bases at Farnborough, Biggin Hill, Tangmere, and North Weald, ensuring each aircraft was fitted within 12 minutes without removing the engine. After 30 days, over 200 Merlin engines were equipped. According to Fighter Command HQ, April 1941, the engine failure rate dropped from 38% to 0.4%. The kill ratio rose from 1:3 to 1:3, 2:1. 94 German aircraft were shot down, and 29 RAF planes were lost. Across 500 air battles, only 2 engine failures were confirmed as caused by enemy fire. One engineer noted, "We finally beat physics, not by rewriting it, but by respecting it." Pilots noticed the difference immediately in handling. Flight Lieutenant Robert Stanford Tuck wrote, "Dived at 400 miles per hour, engine solid." Pilot James Lacey said, "The Merlin breathes again." On the opposing side, Luftwaffe Combat Analysis, April 1941 confirmed. RAF fighters no longer break off pursuit during negative G. The tactic of baiting the enemy into an inverted dive completely failed. The nickname Miss Schilling's orifice spread throughout the RAF. Air Ministry Report C-42/41 affirmed the results were statistically significant. Units in Coastal Command and Fleet Air Arm quickly requested supplies, pushing Rolls-Royce production to 1,000 units per week, with a total of 4,000 units installed nationwide. The benefits extended beyond combat. Production cost per unit was only $0.50, totaling under £1,100, which was 600 times cheaper than a single Merlin engine. According to Fighter Command Review, May 1941, pilot survival rates increased by 17%, and mechanical failures dropped by 60%. Training schools lifted the ban on negative G maneuvers, permitting dives at 420 miles per hour, officially removing the term defensive dive from the syllabus. In the May meeting, a kill rate chart hung on the wall showed the green line of 1,941 shooting upward. The chairman of the technical committee said, "All that for a hole the size of a pin." The room fell silent. Everyone understood this victory came from a 0.04-inch circular hole, worth 50 cents, smaller than a pencil tip but enough to shift the entire doctrine of British aerial combat. The Royal Aeronautical Society, after the war, concluded, "The decision to allow the restrictor's installation was one of the key factors that helped the RAF maintain superiority until the end of 1943. From Dover to Normandy, the sound of the Merlin no longer broke off. It was the sound of a nation reclaiming its breath. And that sound, steady and relentless, was the sound of salvation. As 1942 came to a close, the skies over Britain were quieter than during the early days of the Battle of Britain. But in the laboratories, another war was still being fought, a war of ideas. There, Rolls-Royce engineers continued work on a project that had been delayed since before the war, the pressure carburetor, a device expected to fully replace Beatrice Schilling's 0.04-inch brass restrictor. According to the January 1943 Air Ministry report, the first official prototype was introduced, using pressure control instead of a float chamber, ensuring stable fuel flow in all flight attitudes. On paper, it was perfect. In practice, it was not. Each conversion to a pressure carburetor required 8 hours of maintenance, including removal of fuel lines, replacement of pumps, and recalibration of all pressure gauges. According to estimates by the Fighter Command Technical Branch, Replacing the system across more than 3,000 aircraft would require RAF operations to halt for at least 6 weeks, an unacceptable delay while the war still raged in Europe and North Africa. As a result, many units chose to keep the restrictor. At bases like Duxford, Biggin Hill and Tangmere, hundreds of pilots continued flying with Miss Schilling's orifice well into 1944. Schilling understood this. In an internal talk at Farnborough, she said, "Perfect design means nothing if it arrives too late." That quote became RAE's motto for years to follow. According to the RAE Engineering Summary 1943, the pressure carburetor was technically a success but a failure in timing. It arrived too late, after Schilling's temporary solution had already proven the value of engineering under fire technical work done under life or death conditions, where speed sometimes matters more than finesse. The distinction between research and response became a point of debate in the engineering world throughout the 1940 seconds. A group of Rolls-Royce engineers once wrote in a memorandum to the Air Ministry, "War doesn't reward perfection, it rewards persistence." The war had changed how Britain viewed engineers, no longer just people behind the drawing board, but part of the battlefield itself. As the war shifted into Europe, Schilling continued as a technical advisor for RAE. From mid-1943, she was assigned to the Cold Weather Engine Research Group, supporting Spitfire and Hurricane squadrons stationed in Murmansk, Russia. Winter temperatures there dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, causing oil to thicken and batteries to die within minutes. Schilling developed the preheated oil system, using hot compressed air from auxiliary engines to warm the oil before ignition, enabling aircraft to take off even in deep snow. According to the Allied Arctic Operations Report, this solution increased successful sortie rates by 35% on the Arctic front during the winter of 1942-1943. She didn't stop there. Back in Britain, Schilling and the RAE team investigated power loss at high altitudes. Tests on the Spitfire Mk 9th showed that at 35,000 feet, the air-fuel mixture became too lean, reducing Merlin engine performance by up to 10%. After numerous trials, she designed an altitude-compensating mixture control system, which automatically adjusted the fuel ratio according to air pressure. Test results were recorded in RAE High Altitude Test 1944. Power increased by 8% above 30,000 feet, allowing pilots to maintain speed when facing Germany's first jet aircraft. In the final years of the war, Schilling's name appeared in 17 projects under the Engine Improvement Program, from fuel mixture research for Arctic operations to enhancing supercharger efficiency on the Merlin and Napier Sabre engines. She held no high rank, appeared on no broadcasts, but in engineering circles, everyone knew that Miss Tilly was the one trusted with the toughest problems. A colleague later recalled, "She always took the impossible assignments and made them work." As Britain entered the post-war era, Schilling remained at Farnborough. In 1948, she was appointed OBE Officer of the Order of the British Empire for her wartime technical contributions. The ceremony took place at Buckingham Palace, among hundreds of engineers, pilots, and military officials. After receiving the medal from King George VI, she simply smiled and returned to work the next day. For Schilling, results mattered more than recognition. In the 1950 seconds, the world entered the jet age. Aircraft now used turbine engines instead of pistons, but Schilling's philosophy was still referenced in technical conferences. At a Royal Aeronautical Society symposium, the theme Engineering Under Pressure was inspired directly by her story. In the opening speech, Chief Engineer Stanley Hooker said, "We learned from Beatrice that speed of thought can be as vital as speed of flight." Her RAE office was filled with blueprints, test parts, and stacks of technical documents. Young apprentices were often surprised to find her sitting among machines, clothes stained with oil, eyes focused on some small detail. She didn't teach with theory, but with example. "If it breaks, fix it. If it works, understand why," she said. That line was later engraved on a brass plaque at RAE after her retirement. When asked about her professional philosophy, Schilling once answered bluntly, "A good engineer doesn't build the best machine. They keep the worst one running." That line summed up the spirit of the era, when an entire nation had to survive by keeping what already existed working. It was this that shaped the concept of pragmatist engineering, a practical, results-oriented approach that turned crisis into opportunity for innovation. According to the Engineering Review of Postwar Britain 1950, Schilling laid the foundation for the belief that feasibility matters more than perfection in British applied science. The projects she later took part in, from jet fuel system studies to improving aircraft tire grip on wet runways, carried the same spirit: solutions for reality, not for ambition. As the world emerged from war, her legacy was not in patents but in a new definition of the engineer. They were no longer seekers of perfection, but the ones who made systems work amid chaos. Beatrice Schilling once said in a late-life interview, "The engineer's duty is to make something work when the world is falling apart." That quote was later reprinted in RAE's engineering training manuals for years. She didn't just fix engines, she fixed how people viewed science during wartime. And from Farnborough, her philosophy spread across the globe, proof that sometimes the right idea at the right time is stronger than any flawless design. And that was the real victory, the triumph of ideas over fear. After the war, the world entered an era of reconstruction, and Beatrice Schilling continued working at Farnborough as if she had never taken a single day off. In 1948, she was awarded the title of OBE, Officer of the Order of the British Empire, by King George VI, for her contributions during the most brutal phase of the war. The award ceremony was held at Buckingham Palace, under the soft light of a May morning. According to RAE archives, Schilling wore a simple dress, received her medal, and returned to the laboratory the following day. To her, the true reward was not the title, but the fact that Merlin engines continued to start without stalling. 2 decades later, the world shifted into the jet age. Schilling remained at the Royal Aircraft Establishment until 1969, when she retired at age 60, after 33 years of service. Her retirement file contained a short line: Principal Technical Officer, exceptional service rendered during wartime. She spent the rest of her life on personal projects, restoring vintage motorcycles, and occasionally appearing at technical events as a quiet symbol. On the 18th of November 1990, Beatrice Schilling passed away at the age of 81. British newspapers reported briefly: engineer and motorcycle racer, contributor to wartime aircraft design. But within the engineering community, her name was legendary. A former RAE colleague said at the memorial, "She didn't invent a machine, she restored a generation's confidence." She didn't leave behind many inventions, but she left behind a mindset that engineering could save lives, just like medicine or art. 3 decades later, Britain decided to revive that memory. In 2019, Royal Holloway University of London inaugurated the Beatrice Schilling Building, a facility dedicated to students of electronic and mechanical engineering. During the ceremony, light streamed through the large glass panels, reflecting onto the exhibit at the center of the hall. The original restrictor, a small brass ring smaller than a coin, drilled with a 0.04-inch hole, preserved in a glass case. The plaque beneath it read, "This washer saved over 2,100 pilots." Ugh. When visitors bowed to look at that small object, it was hard to imagine it had once changed the balance of the European skies. But for those who understood history, the brass ring symbolized the intersection of science and courage. An almost anonymous object proved that the value of engineering lies not in grandeur, but in the moments it helps people survive. Generations of engineering students continue to share Schilling's story as a source of inspiration. They learn to ask questions instead of accepting limits, to observe the small to fix the large. Her philosophy, "Perfect design means nothing if it arrives too late," is engraved on the large wall of the building, where morning light shines each day. In recent years, British aviation museums such as the Brooklands Museum and Winchester Heritage have added images and drawings of Schilling to their exhibits. One caption reads, "Her work bridged the gap between invention and survival." Historians call her the engineer against bias, the one who proved that creativity depends not on gender or rank, but on precision and courage, at the moment it matters most. More than 7 decades have passed since the Kenley test, but the story of Beatrice Schilling still resonates in the world of aeronautical engineering. She turned a 0.04-inch detail into a lesson in experimental spirit and personal conviction. A quiet victory, but enduring, spreading across generations, reminding us that science only holds meaning when it serves life. Britain's greatest victory in World War II did not come only from bombers or military strategy, but from the laboratory where oil-stained hands and bold ideas came together to defy the limits of physics. There, courage met precision, and knowledge became the most powerful weapon. Looking back, we realize that a war may reshape the map of the world, but a right idea can redefine the limits of humanity. And Beatrice Schilling left behind a legacy not in words, but in a small brass ring, a design simple enough for anyone to understand, and great enough that no one could forget. And in that 0.04-inch of brass, humanity found the measure of its courage. Have you ever heard an air raid siren in the night, or seen a city fall silent under smoke and shellfire? People like Beatrice Schilling lived through such days here. Every second in the sky could be the last, and every small idea could save thousands of lives. If this story made you pause for a moment to think about those people, leave a follow and a comment to tell me. Have you or your family ever lived through anything during the war years? Are there memories that still make your heart tighten when you recall them? We share these stories so that these people are not forgotten, so that small brass rings and seemingly ordinary decisions are remembered as part of human history. Thank you for listening. One like from you could be a heartbeat that keeps that memory alive so the next generation still remembers that some people fought with intellect, with courage, and with the belief that science can save lives.